What's going on, collectors? And I mean, we all are comic book collectors here, right? And what's one of the biggest things we look for in collecting comic books? It's the quality of the comic books. And who doesn't love a high-grade comic book? Books without spine rolls or color-breaking creases are the cream of the crop when it comes to finding a pristine book. Upon closer inspection, we want our pages to be white and our staples to be secure and rust-free. High-grade comic books are arguably one of the most desirable aspects when it comes to collecting comic books. However, you may have heard me and others mention our creed when it comes to collecting comic books. Buy the book, not the grade. 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 Upon first listen, you may attribute that to collectors who simply cannot afford high-grade comic books, and that's understandably so. Books with high grades fetch higher prices. I'll never purchase a giant size X-Men #1 with a CGC grade of 9.8 because I don't have tens of thousands of dollars. However, I'll certainly settle for a lower graded copy of that book. In that case, yes, I'd rather buy the book than the grade. But what if the high grades didn't make the cut? What if a CGC giant size X-Men #1 at a 9.8 was actually a 9.0 or lower, but masked as a 9.8? Or what about the CGC 9.9 copy of Ultimate Fallout #4, which has some pretty obvious damage? Or, what if I were to sell you my copy of X-Men #59, tell you it's a 9.8, and that it's worth over $30,000 because of the last big sale on it? What if all this reliance on third-party comic book grading is complete and utter nonsense? Or, maybe there is something to these grading companies that we, as comic book collectors, can learn from. Stay tuned, we're going to talk about comic book grading. I personally have a love-hate relationship when it comes to comic book grading. The crux of my issue is that grading is trying to put an objective grade to something that could be considered subjective. And it's really important to distinguish between the two. When we look at things objectively, we think about facts. This comic book is creased. This comic book has a tear on the cover. This comic book cover has yellowed. But when we talk about being subjective, we get into opinions and interpretations. This comic book is creased, but it's not that bad of a crease. Well, compared to what? This comic book has a small tear on the cover, but do you consider it a small tear? This comic book cover has yellowed, but the yellowing isn't that bad. But we can go further with our subjective takes. This is a high-grade book despite the minor tears. This book is complete, but gently worn and has a detached cover. Therefore, it should receive a better grade than 0.5, right? But as collectors and graders, we try to make our subjective opinions of grading comics become objective by assigning numbers to grades. Because this book only has a couple of small marks, it should grade as a 9.8. This book is only gently worn, but the cover is detached, so it will grade at a 0.5, but maybe it could be as high as a 4.0. Assigning a numerical grade to a book gives us collectors more of a concrete answer as to what a book should be graded, but I did say should as in probable, or what a book may probably be graded. And it's in this breakdown where the obvious cracks in the grading process seem to occur. At the end of the day, grading is still subjective. Whether the graders are professionals or not, folks who do grade comic books pull from previous experiences or comparisons to make educated guesses as to what the numerical grade for a book should be. If a grader says a comic book looks better than another comic book of the same issue, there should be concrete evidence to that, such as this Uncanny X-Men #194 here. This grade by comparison would help the better looking book receive the higher grade, as the grader's working off a lesser quality book to judge by. If this poor looking copy of X-Men 194 is graded at a 2, maybe this next one comes across as a 9.6 in comparison. Of course, graders have to consider more than just the cover, but this point still remains, in that grading by comparison is kind of a slippery slope. That all being said, the comparison between the two books is still ultimately based on the grader's history of grading and is grounded in their experience of knowing comic books. For a recent example, Manu, who goes by the 9.9 newsstand on Instagram, shared a story about his Malibu Sun #13 and how he waited for PSA to begin grading comic books because, quote, after guarding this book for years, having graded over a dozen Malibu 9.8s, refusing to submit this particular copy to other companies, knowing the grade it deserved, but knowing how unfair grading practices were, an absolute dream has finally been realized. Manu had what he felt was a 10.0 copy of this book. However, he was concerned other companies may not grade it the same way. Having drawn from his experience as both a collector and a dealer, and having handled many copies of the book, he surmised his book deserved to be a higher grade than what most companies offer, because 9.8s are more the norm than you may realize. So congrats Manu on the 10. Arguably, Manu turned his subjective grading experience into a concrete objective grade. His Malibu Sun number 13 is a 10.0. However, he was concerned that other professional graders may have graded it less than a 10. And again, Manu arguably isn't the quote-unquote professional grader in this situation. PSA was, and he trusted them enough to get his book encapsulated and graded as the 10.0 he feels or knows it deserved to be. Another question to ask is, why, despite there being arguable concrete evidence of a book being a 10.0, did he feel that the book would be only assigned a 9.8? Are other professional graders not doing their job properly? Is there something Manu may have missed and maybe the book shouldn't have received a 10? If so, then why did the grading company PSA give it a 10? All this brings me back to my original question. Are third-party graders nonsensical? I'd argue both yes and no. What can we learn from this example and about comic book grading as a whole? To directly address my thoughts as to why I'm saying yes, I've beaten this drum enough times already in this video. Grading is a subjective thing. People make mistakes, and that's fine. Ultimately, the grade of the book is decided on a variety of factors, and those factors may be weighed differently with each grader. Not only that, but graders can be inconsistent. Every so often, I'll go back and reevaluate my own comics. Sometimes I'll miss things because I'm imperfect. Other times I've written down the wrong grade. Again, I'm imperfect. No one is perfect, and that's humans for you. But those examples are what makes comic book grading so controversial to some people. Another reason why I'm saying yes is because, as I've covered in past videos, graders are often incentivized to offer higher grades. Some grading companies make a percentage off the fair market value of some books. If they can bump a book to be a 9.8 instead of a 9.6, the difference, depending on the book, could literally be thousands of dollars. That's not to say that they are doing that. Grading companies do have the option to override the user's chosen valuation and pricing tier, but they do so before the book is graded. However, at the end of the day, it's still difficult to really determine if certain grades are warranted by grading companies. Fortunately and unfortunately, it's the business side of things. Making a profit is part of our society. But to advocate for the company, if CGC is truly incentivized to release higher grades, why would there have been a concern that Manu's Malibu Sun number 13 would not receive a 10.0 grade? Surely, if a book is really a 10.0, they would want it to grade it a 10 because they would be financially incentivized to do so, right? And yet, despite CGC being in the comic book grading business for over 20 years, the Malibu Sun book was still sent to PSA. Heading back to my original question, are third-party graders nonsensical? I said yes, but I would also say no. Why? Well, I have two reasons. Author Malcolm Gladwell suggested in his book Outliers that it takes about 10,000 hours to master our particular field. While that fact is certainly debatable, the real point to the idea is that one needs to invest time in order to really garner a grasp on what they're doing. For example, if you want to become a great guitar player, playing the same major scale for 10,000 hours doesn't make you great. But spending 10,000 hours with guitars, working on various methods to understand the instrument, chords, scales, song structure, exercise, and so on, doing all of that within 10,000 hours can make you a great guitar player. If you extend that idea to comic books, grading companies have that mastered, not only in hours, but actually in comic books. On cgcdata.com, there are nearly 12 million comic books graded by CGC. That's a lot of comic books. And arguably, with CGC being the size that they are, they have helped the comic book community as a whole better understand how comic book grades work. While CGC is certainly not the originators of the 10-point grading scale, they have certainly modernized it and found a way to weave their way into the hobby as a whole. In fact, CGC has their own comic book grading book, as well as a variety of different aspects to grading directly on their website. The other benefit to third-party graders is that they force to keep each other honest. CBCS versus PGX versus CGC versus PSA, they all strive for the collector to submit their books. Being the best at what they do is what should turn business their way. If comic book grading was truly objective, there wouldn't be variations in the grading process. A 9.0 book from one company should get a 9.0 from another, but that's not always the case. You can go down the rabbit hole online and see people debating the differences on how each comic book company grades and which one is more quote-unquote legitimate than the other. The point being, varying graders keep the hobby healthy and keep raw book collectors like me on my toes. That's not to say I'm always going to be perfect, but being critical in my own grading, thanks to these other third-party graders, makes me both a better and smarter comic book collector. When I purchase comic books, I make sure to go through the pages. I'll scan the front and back cover. I'll check the staples. I may ask about the history of the book and see what else the seller may have to offer to compare their grades with how I grade. It's important for me as a buyer to be informed with what I'm buying because in the end, one must be able to trust their own eyes rather than what they've been told. Coincidentally, while writing the script to this video, I reached out to Cover Price, a company which collects prices for comic books across various markets to gauge pricing trends for comics. They are paired with the CLZ's Collectors app, and I've reviewed the two in a previous video. For graded books, Cover Price separates the price points between grades when displayed in the Collectors app. A book graded at a 2.5 will show the recently sold 2.5 price in the app. However, when it comes to raw books, they're grouped together, 1.5 to 2.5, 3.0 to 4.5, and so on. So if I have a raw book graded as a 2.5, but a recent sale is a raw 1.5, the app will mostly show averages between the 1.5 and the 2.5 price. The average would be the weight of recent sales, not the last sale. I asked Cover Price what the idea was behind the website displaying books like this, and if there was any future plans to group raw books accordingly. I received a response by Matt Day. He's the Director of Operations at Cover Price. He said their method is by design, and he gave me permission to share his response. Quote, slab sales are for books that have been professionally graded. While not perfect, it's much more likely a professionally graded book will be in the advertised condition or something very close to it than the raw book given a grade by an amateur. With this certainty, breaking out the fair market values by slab grade makes a lot of sense. Raw grades are inconsistent at best. He continues, while a book may sell as an 8, it could look more like a 6 and go for a lower than 8 price. With enough sales, however, things start to stabilize. If we were to only put 8.0 raw sales together, there would be fewer sales in that bucket, and it would take longer to counterbalance the low sale with other same grade sales. It's definitely not perfect, but raw grading and bucketing these raw sales is inherently imperfect. They vary in condition, their sellers vary to their reputation, and comics are bought and sold across many thousands of markets on any given day. We try to gather as much of this information as possible, validate it, and present it in a way that people can easily consume. He concludes, raw grades are a ballpark, and as such, a fair market value for a range of raw grades is a better way to convey the inherent uncertainty and imperfection in raw grade valuation. I feel Matt hits it on the nose when it comes to the raw comic book grading. The online market is somewhat of the Wild West when it comes to selling and grading comic books. So what is the best way to help collectors like myself gauge the proper grade of the book, let alone determine its value? As a collector, it's difficult to trust unknown sellers without the comic book being graded by a professional company. For me, when it comes to grading, it's important to trust myself as I'm backed with the knowledge of the hobby from my personal experience. And all of that circles back to third-party graders like CGC and PSA. While keeping each other honest, they also indirectly assist collectors like myself to become smarter and more knowledgeable on what to look out for in comic books. And I'll go as far to say as that they assist in helping collectors better understand the current fair market value. I say this all to say, I feel third-party grading is important for the hobby. While it may not necessarily be everyone's cup of tea, its place in the hobby evolves along with us collectors. Collectors know what they want in high-quality comic books, but we also have our own individual standards, which of course is a subjective opinion. Grading companies want to keep the customer, us collectors, satisfied, and they want to make sure we're getting the best possible service. That's why PSA, a company which historically dealt with grading sports cars, have recently entered the comic book grading game, or why CGC recently acquired JSA for verifying signatures in comic books. These companies heard us and they listened. Of course they want more money for these services too, but that's naturally a part of business and should not be held against them. So when I say buy the book, not the grade, it's not only because I'm never going to afford that expensive copy of Giant Size X-Men #1, it's because I want a book that passes my checks and my balances as a comic book collector. I have my own subjective opinions as to what makes a good comic book and what I find personally appealing too. I love date stamps on covers. I don't mind some glue on my pre-code horror. It doesn't personally bother me that some of my white covers have yellowed. I objectively do not mind these markings on my books. But I also don't want to be told a book is something it's not. I don't want somebody to try and pass a 9.8 off to me when it's actually a 9.0. And that's the case regardless if it's in a slab or not. But at least I can go through a raw comic book to confirm its grade. That being said, there is an inherent value with having your comic books graded and slabbed. There's that trust factor when it comes to trading and selling books, which is always difficult to get with raw ones. Yes, grading companies can slip up, but out of the tens of millions of graded books, the issues are ultimately a very tiny fraction of all graded books. And while others may have a hard time accepting the results from one grader, there's always the option of using another. Or there's the option of just leaving your book raw in a protective cover. There is no rules on how to collect comics, just intuition. Third-party graders are important, but again, you need to trust your own intuition when it comes to accepting those graded numbers. While you may not have the time to spend 10,000 hours to grade comic books, you can still pick up experiences and learn the subtleties of grading. Not every mark on every book will suit you properly, but you have to decide for yourself whether that degrades a comic book for you. Again, grades are objective numbers, but they aren't what decides what comic book is best for you. The truth is out there. Learn from other grading companies, and most importantly, buy the book, not the grade. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.